Chapter 5 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 5 Anthony Collins. Freethought, as developed in the deistic straggles of the 17th century, had to battle for existence against a Puritanic reaction which took its second rise from the worn out licentious age of the last of the Stuarts, and that of the no less dangerous, though concealed, libertinism of the Dutch king. A religious rancor also arose, which, but for the influence of a new power, would have reenacted the tragedy of religious persecution. But this rancor became somewhat modified from the fact that the various parties were now unlike the old schismatics, who were each balanced at the opposite ends of the same pole, extreme papacy on the one hand, and fifth monarchists on the other, when each oscillation from the Protestant centre deranged the balance of enthusiasm, and drove it to the farthest verge of fanaticism, until all religious parties were hurled into one chaos of disunion. Such were the frequent changes of the 17th century, but at its close the power of Deism had evolved a platform on which was to be fought the hostilities of creeds. Here then could not exist that commingling of sects, which were deducible in all their varied extravagance from the Bible. Theology had no longer to fight with itself, but with philosophy. Metaphysics became the Jehu of opinion, and sought to drive its chariot through the fables of the saints. The old doctrines had to be restated to meet new foes. For the Papists, Nonconformists, and Brownists were excluded to make way for the British Illuminati, who spread as much consternation through England as did the French encyclopedists across Europe. The new field of action was only planned, for when Catholicism first opposed Protestantism, its leaders little thought what a Pandoric box it was opening, nor did the divines of the latter sect ever doubt the finality of their own doctrines. They wished to replace one infallibility by another, and the same charge can be substantiated against Deism. When in this Augustan age the freethinking leaders, fresh from the trammels of Christism, first took the name of moral philosophers, they little knew they were paving the way for an atheism they so much dreaded, a democracy more unbridled than their most constitutional wishes, a political economy to be tried for half a century and then to be discarded, a revolutionary fervor which should plow up Europe and then give place to a communism which the first founders of this national agitation would have gazed upon with amazement and shrunk from with despair. Such is the progress of change. The rise of the deistic movement may be defined in a sentence. It was the old struggle of speculative opinion shifting its battleground from theology to philosophy, prior to the one being discarded, and the other developed into positive science. Among the most distinguished of these reformers stands the name of Anthony Collins. Who and what he was we have little opportunity of knowing, save from the scattered notices of contemporaries, but sufficient is left on record to prove him one of the best of men, and the very Coryphaeus of Deism. The twin questions of necessity and prophecy have been examined by him perhaps more ably than by any other liberal author. There are slight discrepancies in relation to the great events of his life. The Abbe Lodovicat says he was born June 21st, 1676, of a rich and noble family, at Heston in Middlesex, and was appointed treasurer of the county. But another account says Hounslow, which we think was the more likely place. He was educated at Eton and Cambridge. He studied for the bar for some time, but being wealthy, ultimately renounced jurisprudence, while his youthful studies admirably fitted him for his subsequent magisterial duties. He was clever, honest, learned, and esteemed by all who knew his character. The elder Disraeli says that he was a great lover of literature, and a man of fine genius, while his morals were immaculate, and his personal character independent. The friendship of Locke alone is sufficient to stamp the character of Collins with honor, and he was one of the most valued friends of this great man. In a volume published by Des Maizeaux, a writer we shall have occasion to notice, in the year 1720, containing a collection of the posthumous works of Locke, there are several letters addressed to Collins, which fully substantiate our opinion. Locke was then an old man, residing in the country, and Collins was a young man in London, who took a pleasure in executing the commissions of his illustrious friend in one of them, dated October 29th, 1703. He says, "If I were now setting out in the world, I should think it my greatest happiness to have such a companion as you, who had a true relish of truth, would in earnest seek it with me, from whom I might receive it undisguised, and to whom I might communicate what I thought true freely. Believe it, my good friend, to love truth for truth's sake is the principal part of human perfection in this world, and the seed plot of all other virtue; and, if I mistake not, you have as much of it as ever I met with in anybody. What then is there wanting to make you equal to the best, a friend for any one to be proud of?" During the following year, the correspondence of Locke appears in a most interesting light. The affectionate inquiries, the kind advice, and the most grateful acknowledgments are made to Collins. On September 11th, Locke writes, "He that has anything to do with you must own that friendship is the natural product of your constitution, and your soul, a noble soil, is enriched with the two most valuable qualities of human nature, truth and friendship. What a treasure have I then in such a friend, with whom I can converse, and be enlightened about the highest speculations." On the 1st of October, he wrote Collins on his rapid decay, "But this I believe he will assure you, that my infirmities prevail so fast on me, that unless you make haste hither, I may lose the satisfaction of ever seeing again a man that I value in the first rank of those I leave behind me." This was written 27 days before his death. 4 days before his decease, he wrote a letter to be given to Collins after his death. This document is one of the most important in relation to the life of the great Freethinker. It irrefragably proves the falsity of everything that may be alleged against the character of Collins. Oates, August 23rd, 1704. For Anthony Collins, Esquire. Dear Sir, by my will you will see that I had some kindness for, and I knew no better way to take care of him than to put him and what I designed for him into your hands and management. The knowledgment I have of your virtues of all kinds secures the trust which, by your permission, I have placed in you, and the peculiar esteem and love I have observed in the young man for you, will dispose him to be ruled and influenced by you. So of that I need say nothing. May you live long and happy in the enjoyment of health, freedom, content, and all those blessings which Providence has bestowed on you and your virtues entitle you to. I know you loved me living, and will preserve my memory now I am dead. I leave my best wishes with you. John Locke. Such is the honorable connection which existed between Locke and Collins. Collins' first publication was a tract, Several of the London Cases Considered, in the year 1700. In 1707 he published an essay concerning the use of reason on propositions, the evidence whereof depends upon human testimony, in which, says Dr. Leland, there are some good observations, mixed with others of a suspicious nature and tendency. It principally turned on the Trinitarian controversy then raging, and is of little interest now. In this year Collins united with Dodwell in the controversy carried on by Dr. Samuel Clarke. One of Clarke's biographers alluded to it thus: Dr. Clarke's arguments in favor of the immateriality and consequent immortality of the soul called out, however, a far more formidable antagonist than Dodwell, in the person of Anthony Collins, an English gentleman of singular intellectual acuteness, but unhappily, of infidel principles. The controversy was continued through several short treatises. On the whole, though Clarke, in some instances, laid himself open to the keen and searching dialectics of his gifted antagonist, the victory certainly remained with the divine. Of course, it is only to be expected that such will be the opinion of an opponent, but it is further proof of Collins's ability and character. In 1703 appeared his celebrated "Discourses of Freethinking," which perhaps created the greatest sensation in the religious world, with the exception of the "Age of Reason," of any book published against Christianity. This book is as able a defense of the freedom of the expression of thought without penalty as was ever published. It is divided into 4 sections. In the first, Freethinking is defined in 5 arguments. In the second, that it is our duty to think freely on those points of which men are denied the right to think freely, such as of the nature and attributes of God, the truth and authority of Scriptures, and of the meaning of Scriptures, in 7 arguments and 11 instances. The third section is the consideration of 6 objections to Freethinking, from the whole of which he concludes: 1. That Freethinkers must have more understanding, and that they must necessarily be the most virtuous people. 2. That they have, in fact, been the most understanding and virtuous people in all ages. Here follows the names of a great number of men whom Collins classified as Freethinkers, and of whom we have no reason to be ashamed. This book was answered by many divines, but none of them emerged from the contest with such Christian honors as the famous Dr. Bentley, considered England's greatest classical scholar. In the same year the Doctor published his reply under the signature of Phileleutheros Lipsiensis. The fame of Bentley was considered equal to Collins's, and it has always been represented that this reply completely crushed the Freethinker. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Bentley principally attacked the Greek quotations, and denounced Collins for his ignorance in not putting his (Bentley's) construction on every disputed word. For this reply, Bentley received the thanks of the University of Cambridge. In condition with this work, Collins is also charged with wilful deception, which has been reproduced in our own lives by divines who perhaps never read a line of Collins. A French edition of the Discourse was translated under the personal inspection of Collins, and it is said that he altered the construction of several sentences to evade the charges brought against him by Bentley. Dr. Leland is particularly eloquent upon this, and the Rev. Mr. Lorimer, of Glasgow, triumphantly plagiarizes the complaint of the men whose defects he can only imitate. There is another charge connected with Bentley and his friends, which it is desirous should be exposed. The elder Disraeli says, "Anthony Collins wrote several well known works, without prefixing his name, but having pushed too far his curious and polemical points, he incurred the odium of a Freethinker, a term which then began to be in vogue, and which the French adopted by translating it, in their way, a strong thinker, or esprit fort. Whatever tendency to liberalize the mind from the dogmas and creeds prevails in these works, the talents and learning of Collins were of the first class. His morals were immaculate, and his personal character independent, but the odium theologicum of those days combined every means to stab in the dark, till the taste became hereditary with some." I may mention a fact of this cruel bigotry which occurred within my own observation, on one of the most polished men of the age. The late Mr. Cumberland, in the romance entitled his Life, gave this extraordinary fact. He said that Dr. Bentley, who so ably replied to Collins' discourse, when many years after he discovered him fallen into great distress, conceiving that by having ruined Collins' character as a writer for ever, he had been the occasion of his personal misery, he liberally contributed to his maintenance. In vain I mentioned to that elegant writer, who was not curious about facts, that this person could never have been Anthony Collins, who had always a plentiful fortune, and when it was suggested to him that this A. Collins, as he printed it, must have been Arthur Collins, the historic compiler, who was often in pecuniary difficulties, still he persisted in sending the lie down to posterity without alteration in his second edition, observing to a friend of mine that the story, while it told well, might serve as a striking instance of his great relative's generosity, and that it should stand because it could do no harm to any but to Anthony Collins, whom he considered as little short of an atheist. Such is a specimen of Christian honor and justice. In 1715 appeared his Philosophical Inquiry into Human Liberty. Dr. Clarke was again his opponent. The publication of this work marked an epoch in metaphysics. Dugald Stewart, in criticizing the discussion on moral liberty between Clarke and Leibnitz, says, "But soon after this controversy was brought to a conclusion by the death of his antagonist, he (Clarke) had to renew the same argument, in reply to his countryman, Anthony Collins, who, following the footsteps of Hobbes, with logical talents not inferior to his master, and with a weight of personal character in his favor, to which his master had no pretensions, gave to the cause which he so warmly espoused a degree of credit amongst sober and inquiring politicians, which it had never before possessed in England." The following are the principal arguments of Collins in reference to liberty and necessity. First, though I deny liberty in a certain meaning of that word, yet I contend for liberty, as it signifies a power in man to do as he wills or pleases. Secondly, when I affirm necessity, I contend only for moral necessity, meaning thereby that man, who is an intelligent and sensible being, is determined by his reason and senses, and I deny any man to be subject to such necessity as is in clocks, watches, and such other beings, which, for want of intelligence and sensation, are subject to an absolute physical or mechanical necessity. Thirdly, I have undertaken to show that the notions I advance are so far from being inconsistent with, that they are the sole foundation of morality and laws, and of rewards and punishments in society, and that the notions I explode are subversive of them. From the above premises, Collins sought to show that man is a necessary agent. 1. From our experience through consciousness. 2. From the impossibility of liberty. 3. From the consideration of the divine prescience. 4. From the nature and use of rewards and punishments. 5. From the nature of morality. Such were the principles on which the great question of necessity has ever been advocated, from Hobbes to Collins, Jonathan Edwards to Mackintosh and Spencer. In the year 1704, Toland dedicated to him a new translation of Aesop's Fables. There are many anecdotes respecting Collins inserted in religious magazines, most of which are false, and all without proof. One of them, related in a most circumstantial manner, appears to be the favorite. It depicts Collins walking out in the country on a Sunday morning, when he meets a countryman returning from church. "Well, Hodge," says Collins, "so you have been enjoying the fresh breezes of nature this fine morning." The clown replied that he had been worshipping nature's God, and proved it by repeating the substance of the Athanasian Creed. Upon which Collins questions him as to the residence of his God, and for a reply is told that his God is so large that he fills the universe, and so small that he dwells in his breast. This sublime fact, we are told, had more effect upon Collins's mind than all the books written against him by the clergy. When will sensible men reject such charlatanism? The next great work of Collins was his Discourse on the Grounds and Reasons of the Christian Religion, in 2 parts. The first containing some considerations on the quotations made from the Old in the New Testament, and particularly on the prophecies cited from the former, and said to be fulfilled in the latter. The second containing an examination of the scheme advanced by Mr. Whiston, in his essay towards restoring the true text of the Old Testament, and for vindicating the citations thence made in the New Testament, to which is prefixed an apology for free debate and liberty of writing. This book took the religious world by storm. It is even thought it struck more dismay amongst divines than his former essay on Freethinking. The book proceeds to show that Christianity is not proved by prophecy, that the apostles relied on the predictions in the Old Testament, and their fulfillment in Jesus as the only sure proof of the truth of their religion. If, therefore, the prophecies are not thoroughly literal and fulfilled distinctly, there can be no proof in Christianity. He then examines the principal prophecies, and dismisses them as allegorical fables too vague to be of any credit. In less than 2 years, no less than 35 books were published in reply to this work, written by the ablest and most influential theologians in England. In 1727, Collins published another large work, The Scheme of Literal Prophecy Considered, in which he still further defends his view, principally against the sophistical reasoning of Whiston, and finally vanquished the whole of his opponents. Perhaps no Freethinker, with the single exception of Hobbes, was so attacked during his life as Collins. Toland and Woolston were persecuted and driven into prison and poverty, but Collins, with his profusion of wealth, could oppose Christianity with applause, mingle in the gaiety of the court, occupy a seat on the magisterial bench, be the welcome guest of the most liberal of the aristocracy, contemporary with others who even languished in prison for the propagation of similar sentiments. Since his day, the clergy have grown wiser. Then the most trivial pamphlet on the deistic side created a consternation amongst the saints, and they strove who should be the first to answer it. Indeed, it was considered a test of honor amongst the clergy to be eager in the exposure of Deism. But this style of warfare was discontinued after the lapse of a few years. The most discerning observers discovered that in proportion to the answers published against liberal works, the influence of the most powerful side decreased. Force, then, gradually interfered, and acts of parliament were considered the only logical refutation of a philosophical heresy. The anomaly of our laws interfered again. Collins was rich, and so must escape the fangs of the law. Thomas Woolston was poor, so his vitals were pierced by laws which Collins escaped. Yet both committed the same offence. In later times, Gibbon traced the rise of Christianity, and about the same time Paine accomplished another portion of the same risk, and the government which prosecuted the plebeian flattered the patrician. But Collins's time was rapidly drawing nigh. On the 13th of December, 1729, he expired, aged 53 years, and to show the esteem in which his character was held, the following notice was inserted in the newspapers of the day. All hostile to his views, yet striving to make it appear that he was, after all, not so great an infidel as his reputation honored him with. On Saturday last died at his house in Harley Square, Anthony Collins, Esquire. He was a remarkably active, upright, and impartial magistrate, the tender husband, the kind parent, the good master, and the true friend. He was a great promoter of literature in all its branches, and an immovable asserter of universal liberty in all civil and religious matters. Whatever his sentiments were on certain points, this is what he declared at the time of his death, viz., that he had always endeavored to the best of his ability to serve God, his king, and his country. So he was persuaded he was going to that place which God hath prepared for them that serve him, and presently afterwards he said, the Catholic religion is to serve God and run. He was an eminent example of temperance and sobriety, and one that had the true art of living. His worst enemies could never charge him with any vice or immorality. With this character the Freethinkers have no right to be dissatisfied. The Abbé Lodivicat says, his library was curious and valuable, always open to the learned, even to his opponents, whom he furnished with pleasure, both with books and arguments, which were employed in confuting him. Mr. Disraeli says he has seen a catalogue of Collins' library elaborately drawn up in his own handwriting, and it must have contained a splendid selection of books. This is proved by the correspondence with Locke, and the extensive number of quotations spread throughout his published works. By the death of Collins, and the defalcation of one who abused the name of a deist, the cause of free thought was impeded at the time when it most needed assistance. Collins had written a great number of tracts and larger works, intending them to be published after his death. One collection of 8 octavo volumes of manuscript containing the attacks upon Christianity, by which he intended his name to be transmitted to posterity, were all arranged ready for publication as his posthumous works. To ensure their creditable appearance, and to reward a man whom he had thought worthy of confidence, and one who professed to be a disciple of Collins, he bequeathed them to Des Maizeaux, then a popular author and editor. He had edited the correspondence of Locke and Collins, written the Light of Baal, and subsequently edited Toland. The idea of Collins was to give his work to Des Maizeaux for a recompense for the trouble of publishing them, while he would derive the whole profits of their sale, which no doubt would be very large. It appears that the widow of Collins was much younger than himself, in league with the Church of England, and was in rather a suspicious friendship with more than one clerical antagonist of her late husband. Des Maizeaux being worked upon conjointly by Mrs. Collins and a person named Tomlinson, was induced to accept a present of 50 guineas, and relinquished the possession of the manuscripts. It was not long, however, before his conscience accused him of the great wrong done to the memory of his benefactor, and to the Freethinking cause. His regret was turned into the most profound compunction for his crime, and in this state of mind he wrote a long letter to one who had been a mutual friend to Collins and himself, acknowledging that he had done a most wicked thing, saying, "I am convinced that I have acted contrary to the will and intention of my dear deceased friend, showed a disregard to the particular mark of esteem he gave me on that occasion; in short, that I have forfeited what is dearer to me than my own life, honor and reputation. I send you the 50 guineas I received, which I do now look upon as the wages of iniquity, and I desire you to return them to Mrs. Collins, who, as I hope it of her justice, equity, and regard to Mr. Collins's intentions, will be pleased to cancel my paper." This appeal, which proved that Des Maizeaux, if he was weak minded, was not absolutely dishonest, had no effect on Mrs. Collins. The manuscripts were never returned. What their contents were, no one now can inform us. We are justified, however, in supposing that as those 8 volumes were the crowning efforts of a mind which in its youth was brilliant in no common degree, must have been even superior to those books which roused England from its dreamy lethargy, and brought about a revolution in controversy. Whether they touched upon miracles, or the external evidences, or the morals of Christism, is unknown. The curtain was drawn over the scene of demolition. 7 years after this time, the controversy was reopened by Mrs. Collins, in the year 1737, on account of a report being current that Mrs. C. had permitted transcripts of those manuscripts to get abroad. The widow wrote some very sharp letters to Des Maizeaux, and he replied in a tone which speaks faithfully of the affection he still bore to Collins' memory. He concludes thus: "Mr. Collins loved me, and esteemed me for my integrity and sincerity, of which he had several proofs. How I have been drawn in to injure him, to forfeit the good opinion he had of me, and which, were he now alive, would deservedly expose me to his utmost contempt, is a grief which I shall carry to the grave. It would be a sort of comfort to me, if those who have consented I should be drawn in, were in some measure sensible of the guilt towards so good, kind, and generous a man." Such is an epitome of the secret history of the manuscripts of Anthony Collins. If we look at the fate of the manuscripts of other deists, we shall have good reasons for believing that some of the ablest writings, meant to give a posthumous reputation to their authors, have disappeared into the hands of either ignorant or designing persons. 5 volumes at least of Toland's works, meant for publication, were by his death irretrievably lost. Blount's manuscripts never appeared. 2 volumes of Tyndall's were seized by the Bishop of London and destroyed. Woolston's manuscripts met with no better fate. Chubb carefully prepared his works, and published them in his lifetime. Bolingbroke made Mallet his confidant, as Collins did by Des Maizeaux. The name of St. John produced £10,000 to Mallet, but those works were left with the tacit acknowledgment that the Scotch poet should write a suitable life of the peer. The letter of Mallet to Lord Cornbury can only be compared to an invitation for a bid for the suppression of the philosophical works of St. John; and if this was not sufficient, we need only instance the apparent solicitation with which he stopped a well known influential dignitary of the church on the day when the works were to appear, by pulling out his watch, and saying, "My lord, Christianity will tremble at 11:45. We may be thankful to the pecuniary poverty of our opponents, even for the possession of the first philosophy. Some of Hume's and Gibbon's works have not yet appeared. The manuscripts of most of the minor Freethinkers disappeared with their authors. There is no doubt but what Robert Taylor left some valuable writings which cannot be recovered. Such is the feeble chance of great men's writings being published when they are no longer alive. With regard to the literary claims of Collins, his works are logically composed and explicitly worded. He invariably commences by stating the groundwork of his opponent's theories, and from them deduces a great number of facts and axioms of a contrary character, and upon those builds his whole chain of argument. He is seldom witty, never uses the flowers of rhetoric, combining a most rigid analysis with a synthetic scheme, admitting but of one unswerving end. He was characteristically great in purpose. He avoided carrying forward his arguments beyond the basis of his facts. Whether in treating the tangled intricacies of necessity, or the theological quagmires of prophecy, he invariably explained without confusing, and refuted without involving other subjects than those legitimately belonging to the controversy. His style of writing was serious, plain, and without an undue levity, yet withal perfectly readable. Men studied Collins who shrunk from contact with the lion hearted Woolston, whose brusque pen too often shocked those it failed to convince. There was a timidity in many of the letters of Blount, and a craving wish to rely more on the witticisms of Browne than was to be found in the free and manly spirit of our hero. To the general public, the abstruse speculations of the persecuted Toland were a barrier which his many classical allusions only heightened; and the musical syllables of Shaftesbury, with his style at once so elevated, so pompous, and so quaint, or the political economic doctrines of Mandeville, all tended to exalt the name of Collins above those of his contemporaries and immediate successors; and posterity cannot fail to place his bust in that historic niche between Hobbes, his master on one hand, and Bolingbroke, his successor, on the other. From the great St. John has descended in the true apostolical descent the mantle of Freethought upon Hume, Gibbon, Paine, Godwin, Carlyle, Taylor, and Owen; and amongst this brilliant galaxy of genius, no name is more deserving of respect than that of Anthony Collins. End of Chapter 5. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers, by Charles Bradlaugh. Read for you by Ted DeLorme. Chapter 6 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers, by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 6. Descartes. René Descartes Duperron, better known as Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, was born at La Haye, in Touraine, of Breton parents, near the close of the 16th century. at a time when Bacon was like the morning sun, rising to shed new rays of bright light over the then dark world of philosophy. The mother of Descartes died while he was but a few days old, and himself a sickly child, he began to take part in the battle of life with but little appearance of ever possessing the capability for action on the minds of his fellows, which he afterwards so fully exercised. Debarred, however, by his physical weakness from many boyish pursuits, he devoted himself to study in his earliest years, and during his youth gained the title of the young philosopher, from his eagerness to learn, and from his earnest endeavors, by inquiry and experiment, to solve every problem presented to his notice. He was educated in the Jesuits' College of La Flèche, and the monument erected to him at Stockholm informs us, that having mastered all the learning of the schools, which proved short of his expectations, he betook himself to the army in Germany and Hungary, and there spent his vacant winter hours in comparing the mysteries and phenomena of nature with the laws of mathematics, daring to hope that the one might serve as a key to the other. Quitting, therefore, all other pursuits, he retired to a little village near Egmont, in Holland, where, spending 25 years in continual reading and meditation, he effected his design. In his celebrated Discourse on Method, he says, "As soon as my age permitted me to leave my preceptors, I entirely gave up the study of letters, and resolving to seek no other science than that which I could find in myself, or else in the great book of the world, I employed the remainder of my youth in travel, in seeing courts and camps, in frequenting people of diverse humors and conditions, in collecting various experiences, and, above all, in endeavoring to draw some profitable reflection from what I saw. For it seemed to me that I should meet with more truth in the reasonings which each man makes in his own affairs, and which, if wrong, would be speedily punished by failure, than in those reasonings which the philosopher makes in his study upon speculations which produce no effect, and which are of no consequence to him, except perhaps that he will be the more vain of them, the more remote they are from common sense, because he would then have been forced to employ more ingenuity and subtlety to render them plausible." At the age of 33, Descartes retired from the world for a period of 8 years, and his seclusion was so effectual during that time, that his place of residence was unknown to his friends. He there prepared the Meditations and Discourse on Method, which have since caused so much pen and ink warfare amongst those who have aspired to be ranked as philosophical thinkers. He became European in fame, and invited by Christina of Sweden, he visited her kingdom, but the rudeness of the climate proved too much for his delicate frame, and he died at Stockholm in the year 1650, from inflammation of the lungs, being 54 years of age at the time of his death. Descartes was perhaps the most original thinker that France had up to that date produced, and contemporary with Bacon, he exercised a powerful influence on the progress of thought in Europe. But although a great thinker, he was not a brave man, and the fear of giving offence to the church and government has certainly prevented him from making public some of his writings, and perhaps has toned down some of these thoughts which, when first uttered, took a higher flight, and struck full home to the truth itself. The father and founder of the deductive method, Descartes still proudly reigns to the present day, although some of his conclusions have been overturned, and others of his thinkings have been carried to conclusions which he never dared to dream of. He gave a strong aid to the tendency of advancing civilization, to separate philosophy from theology, thereby striking a blow slow in its effect, and effectual in its destructive operation, on all priestcraft. In his dedication of the Meditations, he says, "I have always thought that the two questions of the existence of God and the nature of the soul were the chief of those which ought to be demonstrated rather by philosophy than by theology. For although it is sufficient for us, the faithful, to believe in God, and that the soul does not perish with the body, it does not seem possible ever to persuade the infidels to any religion, unless we first prove to them these two things by natural reason." Having relinquished faith, he found that he must choose an entirely new faith in which to march with reason. The old ways were so cumbered with priests and Bibles that progression would have been impossible. This gave us his method. He wanted a starting point from which to reason some indisputable fact upon which to found future thinkings. He has given us the detailed history of his doubts. He has told us how he found that he could, plausibly enough, doubt of everything except his own existence. He pushed his skepticism to the verge of self annihilation. There he stopped. There, in self, there in his consciousness, he found at last an irresistible fact, an irreversible certainty. Firm ground was discovered. He could doubt the existence of the external world, and treat it as a phantasm. He could doubt the existence of God, and treat the belief as a superstition. But of the existence of his own thinking, doubting mind, no sort of doubt was possible. He, the doubter, existed if nothing else existed. The existence that was revealed to him in his own consciousness was the primary fact, the first indubitable certainty. Hence his famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Lewes Biography, History, Philosophy. Proceeding from the certainty of his existence, Descartes endeavors to find other equally certain facts, and for that purpose presents the following doctrine and rules for our guidance. The basis of all certitude is consciousness. Consciousness is the sole foundation of absolute certainty. Whatever it distinctly proclaims must be true. The process is, therefore, rendered clear and simple. Examine your consciousness. Each distinct reply will be a fact. He tells us further that all clear ideas are true, that whatever is clearly and distinctly conceived is true, and in these lie the vitality of his system, the cause of the truth or error of his thinkings. The following are the rules he gave us for the detection and separation of true ideas from false, i.e., imperfect or complex. 1. Never to accept anything as true but what is evidently so. To admit nothing but what so clearly and distinctly presents itself as true, that there can be no reason to doubt it. 2. To divide every question into as many separate parts as possible, that each part being more easily conceived, the whole may be more intelligible. 3. To conduct the examination with order, beginning by that of objects the most simple, and therefore the easiest to be known, and ascending little by little up to knowledge of the most complex. 4. To make such exact calculations and such circumspections as to be confident that nothing essential has been omitted. Consciousness being the basis of all certitude, everything of which you are clearly and distinctly conscious must be true. Everything which you clearly and distinctly conceive exists, if the idea of it involve existence. In these 4 rules we have the essential part of one half of Descartes' system. The other, which is equally important, is the attempt to solve metaphysical problems by mathematical aid. To mathematics he had devoted much of his time. He it was who, at the age of 23, made the grand discovery of the applicability of algebra to geometry. While deeply engaged in mathematical studies and investigations, he came to the conclusion that mathematics were capable of a still further simplification, and of much more extended application. Impressed with the certainty of the conclusions arrived at by the aid of mathematical reasoning, he began to apply mathematics to metaphysics. His ambition was to found a system which should be solid and convincing. Having searched for certitude, he had found its basis in consciousness. He next wanted a method, and hoped he had found it in mathematics. He tells us that those long chains of reasoning, all simple and easy, by which geometers used to arrive at their most difficult demonstrations, suggested to him that all things which came within human knowledge must follow each other in a similar chain, and that provided we abstain from admitting anything as true which is not so, and that we always preserve in them the order necessary to deduce one from the other, there can be none so remote to which we cannot finally attain, nor so obscure but that we may discover them. Acting out this, he dealt with metaphysics as we should with a problem from Euclid, and expected, by rigorous reasoning, to discover the truth. He, like Archimedes, had wished for a standing place from which to use the lever, that should overturn the world; but having a sure standing place in the indubitable fact of his own existence, he did not possess sufficient courage to put forth the mighty power. It was left for one who came after him to fairly attempt the overthrow of the world of error so long existent. Cartesianism was sufficiently obnoxious to the divines to provoke their wrath, and yet, from some of its peculiarities, it has found many opponents among the philosophical party. The Cartesian philosophy is founded on two great principles, the one metaphysical, the other physical. The metaphysical is Descartes' foundation stone, the "I think, therefore I am." This has been warmly attacked as not being logical. Descartes said his existence was a fact above and beyond all logic. Logic could neither prove nor disprove it. The cogito ergo sum was not new itself, but it was the first stone of a new building, the first step in a new road. From this fact Descartes tried to reach another, and from that others. The physical principle is that nothing exists but substance, which he makes of two kinds: the one a substance that thinks, the other a substance extended. Actual thought and actual extension are the essence of substance, so that the thinking substance cannot be without some actual thought, nor can anything be retrenched from the extension of a thing, without taking away so much of its actual substance. In his physical speculations, Descartes has allowed his imagination to run very wild. His famous theory of vortices is an example of this. Assuming extension to be the essence of substance, he denied the possibility of a vacuum by that assumption. For if extension be the essence of substance, wherever extension is, there substance must be. This substance he assumes to have originally been divided into equal angular particles, each endowed with an equal degree of motion. Several systems or collections of these particles he holds to have a motion about certain equidistant points or centres, and that the particles moving round these composed so many vortices. These angular particles, by their intestine motions, he supposes to become, as it were, ground into a spherical form. The parts rubbed off are called matter of the first element, while the spherical globules he calls matter of the second element. And since there would be a large quantity of this element, he supposes it to be driven towards the center of each vortex by a circular motion of the globules, and that there it forms a large spherical body such as the sun. This sun being thus formed, and moving about its own axis with the common matter of the vortex, would necessarily throw out some parts of its matter, through the vacuities of the globules of the second element constituting the vortex, and this especially at such places as are farthest from its poles, receiving at the same time in, by these poles, as much as it loses in its equatorial parts. And by these means it would be able to carry round with it those globules that are nearest with the greater velocity, and the remoter with less. And further, those globules which are nearest the center of the sun must be smallest, because were they greater or equal, they would, by reason of their velocity, have a greater centrifugal force, and recede from the center. If it should happen that any of these sun like bodies in the centers of the several vortices should be so incrusted and weakened as to be carried about in the vortex of the true sun, if it were of less solidity, or had less motion than the globules toward the extremity of the solar vortex, it would descend towards the sun, till it met with globules of the same solidity, and susceptible of the same degree of motion with itself. And thus, being fixed there, it would be forever after carried about by the motion of the vortex, without either approaching any nearer to, or receding from the sun, and so become a planet. Supposing, then, all this, we are next to imagine that our system was at first divided into several vortices, in the center of each of which was a lucid spherical body, and that some of these, being gradually incrustated, were swallowed up by others, which were larger and more powerful, till at last they were all destroyed and swallowed up by the biggest solar vortex, except some few which were thrown off in right lines from one vortex to another, and so became comets. It should also be added, that in addition to these two elements mentioned above, those particles which may yet exist, and be only in the course of reduction to their globular form, as it still retain their angular proportions, form a third element. This theory has found many opponents, but in this state of our work we conceive our duty to be that of giving a simple narrative of the philosopher's ideas, rather than a history of the various criticisms upon those ideas, the more especially as our pages scarcely afford room for such a mode of treatment. Having formed his method, Descartes proceeded to apply it. The basis of certitude being consciousness, he interrogated his consciousness, and found that he had an idea of a substance infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, omniscient, omnipotent. This he called an idea of God. He said, "I exist as a miserably imperfect finite being, subject to change, ignorant, incapable of creating anything. I find by my finitude that I am not the infinite, by my liability to change that I am not the immutable, by my ignorance that I am not the omniscient, in short, by my imperfection that I am not the perfect. Yet an infinite, immutable, omniscient, and perfect being must exist, because infinity, immutability, omniscience, and perfection are applied as correlatives in my ideas of finitude, change, etc. God therefore exists. His existence is clearly proclaimed in my consciousness, and therefore ceases to be a matter of doubt, any more than the fact of my own existence. The conception of an infinite being proved his real existence, for if there is not really such a being, I must have made the conception. But if I could make it, I can also unmake it, which evidently is not true. Therefore there must be, externally to myself, an archetype from which the conception was derived. All that we clearly and distinctly conceive as contained in anything is true of that thing. Now we conceive clearly and distinctly that the existence of God is contained in the idea we have of him. Ergo, God exists." Lewis's Biography of History and Philosophy. Descartes was of the opinion that his demonstrations of the existence of God equal or even surpass in certitude the demonstrations of geometry. In this opinion, we must confess, we cannot share. He has already told us that the basis of all certitude is consciousness, that whatever is clearly and distinctly conceived must be true, that imperfect and complex conceptions are false ones. The first proposition, all must admit, is applicable to themselves. I conceive a fact clearly and distinctly, and despite all resistance am compelled to accept that fact. And if that fact be accepted beyond doubt, no higher degree of certainty can be attained. That 2 and 2 are 4, that I exist, are facts which I never doubt. The cogito ergo sum is irresistible, because indubitable; but cogito ergo Deus est is a sentence requiring much consideration, and upon the face of it is no syllogism, but on the contrary is illogical. If Descartes meant I am consciousness, that I am not the whole of existence, he would be indisputable. But if he meant that I can be conscious of an existence entirely distinct, apart from, and external to that very consciousness, then his whole reasoning from that point appears fallacious. We use the word I as given by Descartes. Mill, in his System of Logic, says, "The ambiguity in this case is in the pronoun I, by which in one place is to be understood my will, in another the laws of my nature. If the conception existing as it does in my mind had no original without, the conclusion would unquestionably follow that I had made it; that is, that the laws of my nature had spontaneously evolved it. But that my will made it would not follow. Now, when Descartes afterwards adds that I cannot unmake the conception, he means that I cannot get rid of it by an act of my will, which is true, but is not the proposition required. That what some of the laws of my nature have produced, other laws, or those same laws in other circumstances, might not subsequently efface, he would have found it difficult to establish." Treating the existence of God as demonstrated from the a priori idea of perfection and infinity, and by the clearness of his idea of God's existence, Descartes then proceeds to deal with the distinction between body and soul. To prove this distinction was to him an easy matter. The fundamental and essential attribute of substance must be extension, because we can denude substance of every quality but that of extension. This we cannot touch without at the same time affecting the substance. The fundamental attribute of mind is thought. It is in the act of thinking that the consciousness of existence is revealed. To be without thought would be to be without consciousness. Descartes has given us, among others, the axiom that two substances are really distinct when their ideas are complete, and no way imply each other. The idea of extension is complete and distinct from the idea of thought, which latter is also clear and distinct by itself. It follows, therefore, that substance and mind are distinct in essence. Descartes has, from the vagueness of some of his statements, subjected himself to the charge of asserting the existence of innate ideas, and the following quotations will speak for themselves on the subject. When I said that the idea of God is innate in us, I never meant more than this, that nature has endowed us with a faculty by which we may know God. But I have never either said or thought that such ideas had an actual existence, or even that they were a species distinct from the faculty of thinking. Although the idea of God is so imprinted on our minds that every person has within him the faculty of knowing him, it does not follow that there may not have been various individuals who have passed through life without ever making this idea a distinct object of apprehension. And in truth, they who think they have an idea of a plurality of gods have no idea of God whatever. This seems explicit as negating the charge of holding the doctrine of innate ideas, but in the Edinburgh Review several passages are given, amongst which is the following: "By the word idea I understand all that can be in our thoughts, and I distinguish three sorts of ideas: adventitious, like the common idea of the sun, framed by the mind, such as that which astronomical reasoning gives of the sun; and innate, as the idea of God, mind, body, a triangle, and generally all those which represent true, immutable, and eternal essences." With regard to these rather opposite statements, Lewes says, "If Descartes, when pressed by objections, gave different explanations, we must only set it down to a want of a steady concept of the vital importance of innate ideas to his system. The fact remains that innate ideas form the necessary groundwork of the Cartesian doctrine. The radical error of all ontological speculation lies in the assumption that we have ideas independent of experience. because experience can only tell us of ourselves or of phenomena. Of noumena it can tell us nothing. The fundamental question, then, of modern philosophy is this: have we any ideas independent of experience? Descartes' disciples are of two classes: the mathematical cultivators of physics, and the deductive cultivators of philosophy. The first class of disciples are far in advance of their chief, and can only be considered as having received an impulse in a true direction. The second class unhesitatingly accepted his principles, and continued his thinking, although they developed his system in a different manner, and arrived at stronger conclusions than Descartes' courage would have supported. Some of the physical speculations of Descartes have been much ridiculed by subsequent writers. But many reasons may be urged, not only against that ridicule, but also against the more moderate censure which several able critics have dealt out against the intellectual character of Descartes. It should be remembered that the theories of all his predecessors were mere conjectural speculations respecting the places and paths of celestial bodies, etc. Innumerable hypotheses had been formed and found useless, and we ought rather to look to what Descartes did accomplish under the many difficulties of his position in respect to the then state of scientific knowledge, than to judge harshly of those speculations which, though attended with no beneficial result to humanity at large, were doubtless well intended by their author. He was the first man who brought optical science under the command of mathematics, by the discovery of the law of refraction of the ordinary ray through diaphanous bodies; and probably there is scarcely a name on record, the bearer of which has given a greater impulse to mathematical and philosophical inquiry than Descartes. Although, as a mathematician, he published but little, yet in every subject which he has treated he has opened not only a new field for investigation, but also a new road for the investigators to proceed by. His discovery of the simple application of the notation of indices to algebraical powers has totally remodeled the whole science of algebra. His conception of expressing the fundamental property of curved lines and curved surfaces by equations between the coordinates has led to an almost total supersedence of the geometry of the ancients. Contemporary with Galileo, and with a knowledge of the persecution to which that father of physics was being subjected by the Church, we are tempted to express our surprise that Descartes did not extend the right hand of fellowship, help, and sympathy to his brother philosopher. But it is, nevertheless, the fact, that either jealous of the fame of Galileo, as some have alleged, or from a fear of being involved in the same persecutions, Descartes abstained from visiting the astronomer, although travelling for some time near his place of abode in Italy. Lewis, in his Life of Descartes, says, "Descartes was a great thinker, but having said this, we have almost exhausted the praise we can bestow on him as a man. In disposition he was timid to servility. While promulgating the proofs of the existence of the Deity, he was in evident alarm lest the Church should see something objectionable in them. He had also written an astronomical treatise, but hearing of the fate of Galileo, he refrained from publishing, and always used some chicanery in speaking of the world's movement. He was not a brave man. He was also not an affectionate one. There was in him a deficiency of all finer feelings. But he was even tempered, and studious of not giving offence." We are tempted, after a careful perusal of the life and writings of Descartes and his contemporaries, to be of opinion that he was a man who wished to be considered the chief thinker of his day, and who shunned and rejected the offers of friendship from other philosophers, lest they, by being associated with him, should jointly wear laurels which he was cultivating solely to form a crown for himself. Despite all, his brow still bears a crown, and his fame has a freshness that we might all be justly proud of, if appertaining to ourselves. We trust that in these few pages we have succeeded in presenting Descartes, to such of our readers who were unacquainted with his writings, sufficiently well to enable them to appreciate him, and to induce them to search further; and at the same time, we hope that those better acquainted with him will not blame us for the omission of much which they may consider more important than the matter of which appears in this little tract. We have endeavored to picture Descartes as the founder of the deductive method, as having the foundation stone of all his reasoning in his consciousness. End of chapter 6 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. Read for you by Ted DeLorme. Chapter 7 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 7. Voltaire. François-Marie Arouet, better known by the name of Voltaire, was born at Châtenay on the 20th of February, 1694. By assuming the name of Voltaire, young Arouet followed the custom, at the time generally practised by the rich citizens and younger sons, who, leaving the family name to the heir, assumed that of a fief, or perhaps of a country house. The father of M. de Voltaire was treasurer to the Chamber of Accounts, and his mother, Margaret d'Aumont, was of a noble family of Poitou. The fortune which the father enjoyed, enabling him to bestow a first-class education upon the young Arouet, who was sent to the Jesuits' College, where the sons of the nobility received their education. While at school, Voltaire began to write poetry, and gave signs of a remarkable genius. His tutors, Father Poré and Jay, from the boldness and independence of his mind, predicted that he would become the apostle of Deism in France. This prediction he fulfilled. Voltaire was, says Lord Brougham, through his whole life a sincere believer in the existence and attributes of the Deity. He was firm and decided, and an openly declared unbeliever in Christianity. But he was, without any hesitation or any intermission, a theist. His open declaration of disbelief in the inspiration of the Bible, and his total rejection of the dogmas of Christianity, laid him open to the malignant attacks and misrepresentations of the priesthood and the bigots of Europe, and so strong were they, that his life was continually in danger. Lord Brougham, in his Men of Letters of the time of George III., says, "Voltaire's name is so intimately connected in the minds of all men with infidelity, in the minds of most men with irreligion, and in the minds of all who are not well informed with these qualities alone, that whoever undertakes to write his life and examine his claims to the vast reputation which all the hostile feelings excited by him against himself have never been able to destroy, or even materially to impair, has to labor under a great load of prejudice, and can hardly expect, by any detail of particulars, to obtain for his subject even common justice at the hands of the general reader." Voltaire was born in a corrupt age, and in a capital where it was fashionable to be immoral. When he left college, he was introduced by his own godfather, the Abbé de Chateauneuf, to the notorious Ninon de l'Enclos, who, at her death, left him by will 2,000 livres to purchase books. In estimating the character of Voltaire, a due consideration must be had for the period in which he lived, and of the nature of the society amidst which he was reared. He lived 20 years under the reign of Louis XIV., and during the whole of the reign of the infamous Louis XV., when kings, courtiers, and priests set the example of the grossest immorality. It was then, as Voltaire said, that to make the smallest fortune it was better to say 4 words to the mistress of a king than to write 100 volumes. Voltaire's life, from his youth upwards, was a stormy one. After he left college, his father, finding him persisting in writing poetry, and living at large, forbade him in his house. He insisted upon his son binding himself to an attorney, but his restless disposition quite unfitted him for regular employment, and he soon quitted the profession. He early made the acquaintance of the most celebrated men of his time, but his genius, his wit, and his sarcasm soon raised up numerous enemies. At the age of 22, he was accused of having written a satire upon Louis XIV., who was just dead, and was thrown into the Bastille. But he was not cast down. It was here that he sketched his poem of the League, corrected his tragedy of Oedipus, and wrote some merry verses on the misfortune of being a prisoner. The Regent, Duke of Orleans, being informed of his innocence, restored him to freedom, and granted him a recompense. "I thank your Royal Highness," said Voltaire, "for having provided me with food, but I hope you will not hereafter trouble yourself concerning my lodging." Voltaire, with his activity of mind, and living to so great an age, must necessarily produce many works. They are voluminous, consisting of history, poetry, and philosophy. His dramatic pieces are numerous, many of which are considered second only to Shakespeare's: Oedipus, Zadig, Ingenue, Zaire, Henriade, Irene, Tancred, Mahomet, Merope, Saul, Alzire, Les Fanatismes, Mariamne, Gaston de Foix, Enfant Projet, Pucelle d'Orleans, an essay on Fire, the Elements, History of Charles XII., Lectures on Man, Letters on England, Memoirs, Voyage of the Sacramentado, Micromegas, Maid of Orleans, Brutus, Adelaide, Death of Caesar, Temple of Taste, Essay on the Manners and Spirit of Nations, an Examination of the Holy Scriptures, and the Philosophical Dictionary, are works that emanated from the active brain of this wit, poet, satirist, and philosopher. In 1722, while at Brussels, Voltaire met Jean Baptiste Rousseau, whose misfortunes he deplored, and whose poetic talents he esteemed. Voltaire read some of his poems to Rousseau, and he in return read to Voltaire his Ode addressed to Posterity, which Voltaire, it is asserted, told him would never arrive at the place to which it was addressed. The two poets parted irreconcilable foes. In 1725, Voltaire was again shut up in the Bastille, through attempting to revenge an insult inflicted upon him by a courtier. At the end of 6 months he was released, but ordered to quit Paris. He sought refuge in England in 1726. He was the guest in that country of a Mr. Falconer, of Wandsworth, whose hospitality he remembered with affection so long as life lasted. Voltaire was known to most of the wits and freethinkers of that day in England. At this early age he was at war with Christianity. His visit to England, says Lamartine, gave assurance and gravity to his incredulity, for in France he had only known libertines, in England he knew philosophers. He went to visit Congreve, who had the affectation to tell him that he, Congreve, valued himself not on his authorship, but as a man of the world, to which Voltaire administered a just rebuke by saying, "I should never have come so far to see a gentleman." Voltaire soon acquired an ample fortune, much of which was expended in aiding men of letters, and in encouraging such youth as he thought discovered the seeds of genius. The use he made of riches might prevail on envy itself to pardon him their acquirement. His pen and his purse were ever at the service of the oppressed. Calas, an infirm old man, living at Toulouse, was accused of having hung his son to prevent his becoming a Catholic. The Catholic population became inflamed, and the young man was declared to be a martyr. The father was condemned to the torture and the wheel, and died protesting his innocence. The family of Calas was ruined and disgraced. Voltaire, assuring himself of the innocence of the old man, determined to obtain justice for the family. To this end he labored incessantly for 3 years. In all this time, he said, a smile did not escape him for which he did not reproach himself as for a crime. his efforts were successful. Nor was this the only cause in which he was engaged on the side of the weak and the wronged against the powerful and the persecuting. His whole life, though maligned as an infidel and a scoffer, was one long act of benevolence. On learning that a young niece of Corneille languished in a condition unworthy of his name, Voltaire, in the most delicate manner, invited her to his house, and she there received an education suitable to the rank that her birth had marked for her in society. "It is the duty of a soldier," he said, "to succor the niece of his general." Voltaire lived for a time at the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia, and for many years carried on a correspondence with that monarch. He quarrelled with the king, and left the court in a passion. An emissary was despatched to him to request an apology, who said he was to carry back to the king his answer verbatim. Voltaire told him that the king might go to the devil. On being asked if that was the message he meant to be delivered, "Yes," he answered, "and add to it that I told you that you might go there with him." In his Memoirs he has drawn a most amusing picture of his Prussian Majesty. He also says, "Priests never entered the palace, and in a word, Frederick lived without religion, without a council, and without a court." Wearied with his rambling and unsettled mode of living, Voltaire bought an estate at Ferney, in the Pays de Gais, where he spent the last 20 years of his life. He rebuilt the house, laid out gardens, kept a good table, and had crowds of visitors from all parts of Europe. Removed from whatever could excite momentary or personal passion, he yielded to his zeal for the destruction of prejudice, which was the most powerful and active of all the sensations he felt. This peaceful life, seldom disturbed except by the threats of persecution, rather than persecution itself, was adorned by those acts of enlightened and bold benevolence, which, while they relieve the sufferings of certain individuals, are of any service to the whole human race. He was known to Europe as the Sage of Ferney. After an absence of more than 27 years, he revisited Paris at the beginning of 1778. He had just finished his play of Irene, and was anxious to see it performed. His visit was an ovation. He had outlived all his enemies. After having been the object of unrelenting persecution by the priests and corrupt courtiers of France for a period of more than 50 years, he yet lived to see the day when all that was the most eminent in station or most distinguished in talents, all that most shone in society or most ruled in court, seemed to bend before him. At this period he, for the first time, saw Benjamin Franklin. They embraced each other in the midst of public acclamations, and it was said to be Solon who embraced Sophocles. Voltaire did not survive his triumph long. His unwearied activity induced him, at his great age, to commence a dictionary upon a novel plan, which he prevailed upon the French Academy to take up. These labors brought on spitting of blood, followed by sleeplessness, to obviate which he took opium in considerable quantities. Condorcet says that the servant mistook one of the doses, which threw him into a state of lethargy, from which he never rallied. He lingered for some time, but at length expired on the 30th of May, 1778, in his 85th year. It was the custom in those days, and prevails to a considerable extent even in our own time, for the religious world to fabricate horrible death beds of all Freethinkers. Voltaire's last moments were distorted by his enemies after the approved fashion, and notwithstanding the most unqualified denial on the part of Dr. Burard and others, who were present at his death, there are many who believe these falsehoods at this moment. Voltaire died in peace, with the exception of the petty annoyances to which he was subjected by the priests. The philosophers, too, who wished that no public stigma should be cast upon him by the refusal of Christian burial, persuaded him to undergo confession and absolution. This, to oblige his friends, he submitted to, But when the cure one day drew him from his lethargy by shouting into his ear, "Do you believe the divinity of Jesus Christ?" Voltaire exclaimed, "In the name of God, sir, speak to me no more of that man, but let me die in peace." This put to flight all doubts of the pious, and the certificate of burial was refused. But the prohibition of the Bishop of Troyes came too late. Voltaire was buried at the monastery of Celieres, in Champagne, of which his nephew was abbot. Afterwards, during the first French Revolution, the body, at the request of the citizens, was removed to Paris, and buried in the Pantheon. Lamartine, in his History of the Girondists, page 149, speaking of the ceremony, says, "On the 11th of July, the departmental and municipal authorities went in state to the Barry of Charenton to receive the mortal remains of Voltaire, which were placed on the ancient site of the Bastille, like a conqueror on his trophies. His coffin was exposed to public gaze, and a pedestal was formed for it of stones torn from the foundations of this ancient stronghold of tyranny, and thus Voltaire, when dead, triumphed over those stones which had triumphed over and confined him when living." On one of the blocks was the inscription, "Receive on this spot, where despotism once fettered thee, the honors decreed to thee by thy country." The coffin of Voltaire was deposited between those of Descartes and Mirabeau, the spot predestined for this intermediary genius between philosophy and policy, between the design and the execution. The aim of Voltaire's life was the destruction of prejudice and the establishment of reason. Deists, said W. J. Fox in 1819, have done much for toleration and religious liberty. It may be doubted if there be a country in Europe where that cause has not been advanced by the writings of Voltaire. In the preface and conclusion to the examination of the Scriptures, Voltaire says, "The ambition of domineering over the mind is one of the strongest passions. A theologian, a missionary, or a partisan of any description, is always for conquering like a prince, and there are many more sects than there are sovereigns in the world. To whose guidance shall I submit my mind? Must I be a Christian because I happened to be born in London or in Madrid? Must I be a Mussulman because I was born in Turkey? As it is myself alone that I ought to consult, the choice of a religion is my greatest interest. One man adores God by Mahomet, another by the Grand Lama, another by the Pope. Weak and foolish men, adore God by your own reason. I have learnt that a French vicar by the name of John Meslier, who died a short time since, prayed on his death bed that God would forgive him for having taught Christianity. I have seen a vicar in Dorsetshire relinquish a living of £200 a year, and confess to his parishioners that his conscience would not permit him to preach the shocking absurdities of the Christians. But neither the will nor the testament of John Meslier, nor the declaration of this worthy vicar, are what I consider decisive proofs. Uriel Acosta, a Jew, publicly renounced the Old Testament in Amsterdam. However, I pay no more attention to the Jew Acosta than to Parson Meslier. I will read the arguments on both sides of the trial, with careful attention, not suffering the lawyers to tamper with me, but will weigh, before God, the reasons of both parties, and decide according to my conscience. I commence by being my own instructor. I conclude that every sensible man, every honest man, ought to hold Christianity in abhorrence. The great name of Theist, which we can never sufficiently revere, is the only name we ought to adopt. The only gospel we should read is the grand book of nature, written with God's own hand and stamped with his own seal. The only religion we ought to profess is to adore God and act like honest men. It would be as impossible for this simple and eternal religion to produce evil, as it would be impossible for Christian fanaticism not to produce it. But what shall we substitute in its place, say you? What? A ferocious animal has sucked the blood of my relatives. I tell you to rid yourselves of this beast, and you ask me what you shall put in its place. Is it you that put this question to me? Then you are 100 times more odious than the pagan pontiffs, who permitted themselves to enjoy tranquillity among their ceremonies and sacrifices, who did not attempt to enslave the mind by dogmas, who never disputed the powers of the magistrates, and who introduced no discord among mankind. You have the face to ask what you must substitute in the place of your fables." As will be seen by his exclamation on his death bed, Voltaire was no believer in the divinity of Christ. He disbelieved the Bible in toto. The accounts of the doings of the Jewish kings, as represented in the Old Testament, he has unsparingly ridiculed in the drama of Saul. The quiet irony of the following will be easily appreciated: Divinity of Jesus. The Socinians, who are regarded as blasphemers, do not recognize the divinity of Jesus Christ. They dare to pretend, with the philosophers of antiquity, with the Jews, the Mahometans, and most other nations, that the idea of a God man is monstrous, that the distance from God to man is infinite, and that it is impossible for a perishable body to be infinite, immense, or eternal. They have the confidence to quote Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea, in their favor, who, in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 1, Chapter 9, declares that it is absurd to imagine the uncreated and unchangeable nature of Almighty God taking the form of man. They cite the fathers of the Church, Justin and Tertullian, who have said the same thing, Justin in his dialogue with Trophonius, and Tertullian in his discourse against Praxias. They quote St. Paul, who never calls Jesus Christ God, and who calls him man very often. They carry their audacity so far as to affirm that the Christians passed 3 entire ages in forming by degrees the apotheosis of Jesus, and that they only raised this astonishing edifice by the example of the pagans, who had deified mortals. At first, according to them, Jesus was only regarded as a man inspired by God, and then as a creature more perfect than others. They gave him some time after a place above the angels, as St. Paul tells us. Every day added to his greatness. He in time became an emanation, proceeding from God. This was not enough. He was even born before time. At last he was God, consubstantial with God. Crellius, Vogelsius, Natalis, Alexander, and Hornbeck have supported all these blasphemies by arguments which astonish the wise and mislead the weak. Above all, Faustus Socinus spread the seeds of this doctrine in Europe, and at the end of the 16th century a new species of Christianity was established. There were already more than 300. Philosophical Dictionary, Vol. 1, page 405. Though a firm and consistent believer in the being of a God, Voltaire was no bigot. The calm reasoning of the following passage does honor to its author. Faith. Divine faith, about which so much has been written, is evidently nothing more than incredulity brought under subjection. For we certainly have no other faculty than the understanding by which we can believe, and the objects of faith are not those of the understanding. We can believe only what appears to be true, and nothing can appear true but in one of the 3 following ways: by intuition or feeling, as I exist, I see the sun; or by an accumulation of probability, amounting to certainty, as there is a city called Constantinople; or by positive demonstration, as triangles of the same base and height are equal. Faith, therefore, being nothing at all of this description, can no more be a belief, a persuasion, than it can be yellow or red. It can be nothing but the annihilation of reason, a silence of adoration at the contemplation of things absolutely incomprehensible. Thus, speaking philosophically, no person believes the Trinity, no person believes that the same body can be in 1,000 places at once, And he who says, I believe these mysteries, will see, beyond the possibility of a doubt, if he reflects for a moment on what passes in his mind, that these words mean no more than, I respect thee, mysteries. I submit myself to those who announce them, for they agree with me that my real reason, their own reason, believe them not. But it is clear, if my reason is not persuaded, I am not persuaded, and my reason cannot possibly be two different things. It is an absolute contradiction that I should receive that as true which my understanding rejects as false. Faith, therefore, is nothing but submissive or deferential incredulity. But why should this submission be exercised when my understanding invincibly recoils? The reason, we well know, is that my understanding has been persuaded that the mysteries of my faith are laid down by God himself. All then that I can do, as a reasonable being, is to be silent and adore. That is what divines call external faith, and this faith neither is nor can be anything more than respect for things incomprehensible, in consequence of the reliance I place on those who teach them. If God himself were to say to me,
Thought is of an olive color. The square of a certain number is bitter.
I should certainly understand nothing at all from these words. I could not adopt them either as true or false, but I will repeat them if he commands me to do it, and I will make others repeat them at the risk of my life. This is faith. It is nothing more than obedience. In order to obtain a foundation, then, for this obedience, it is merely necessary to examine the books which require it. Our understanding, therefore, should investigate the books of the Old and New Testament, just as it would Plutarch or Livy, and if it finds in them incontestable and decisive evidences, evidences obvious to all minds, and such as would be admitted by men of all nations, that God himself is their author, then it is our incumbent duty to subject our understanding to the yoke of faith. Prayer. We know of no religion without prayers. Even the Jews had them, although there was no public form of prayer among them before the time when they sang their canticles in their synagogues, which did not take place until a late period. The people of all nations, whether actuated by desires or fears, have summoned the assistance of the divinity. Philosophers, however, more respectful to the Supreme Being, and rising more above human weakness, have been habituated to substitute for prayer resignation. This, in fact, is all that appears proper and suitable between creature and Creator. But philosophy is not adapted to the great mass of mankind. It soars too highly above the vulgar. It speaks a language they are unable to comprehend. To propose philosophy to them would be just as weak as to propose the study of conic sections to peasants or fishwomen. Among philosophers themselves I know of no one besides Maximus Tyrius who has treated of this subject. The following is the substance of his ideas upon it. The designs of God exist from all eternity. If the object prayed for be conformable to his immutable will, it must be perfectly useless to request of him the very thing which he has determined to do. If he is prayed to for the reverse of what he has determined to do, he is prayed to be weak, fickle, and inconstant. Such a prayer implies that this is thought to be his character, and is nothing better than ridicule or mockery of him. You either request of him what is just and right, in which case he ought to do it, and it will be actually done without any solicitation, which in fact shows distrust of his rectitude; or what you request is unjust, and then you insult him. You are either worthy or unworthy of the favor you implore. If worthy, he knows it better than you do yourself. If unworthy, you commit an additional crime in requesting that which you do not merit. In a word, we offer up prayers to God only because we have made him after our own image. We treat him like a pasha or a sultan who is capable of being exasperated and appeased. In short, all nations pray to God. The sage is resigned and obeys him. Let us pray with the people, and let us be resigned to him with the sage. We have already spoken of the public prayer of many nations, and of those of the Jews. That people have had one from time immemorial, which deserves all our attention, from its resemblance to the prayer taught us by Jesus Christ himself. This Jewish prayer is called the Kaddish, and begins with these words: "O God, let thy name be magnified and sanctified. Make thy kingdom to prevail. Let redemption flourish, and the Messiah come quickly." As this Kaddish is recited in Chaldee, it has induced the believer that it is as ancient as the captivity, and that it was at that period that the Jews began to hope for a Messiah, a liberator or redeemer, whom they have since prayed for in the seasons of their calamities. Voltaire's contempt for the Bible led him to use the language of Holy Writ in the coarsest jokes, although perhaps with such material the jokes could not well be otherwise than coarse. The following letter he addressed to M. Bayon, Intendant of Lyons, on account of a poor Jew taken up for uttering contraband goods. This kind of writing obtained for Voltaire the title of Scoffer. Blessings on the Old Testament, which gives me this opportunity of telling you that amongst all those who adore the New, there is not one more devoted to your service than myself, a certain descendant of Jacob, a pedlar, as all these gentlemen are, whilst he is waiting for the Messiah, waits also for your protection, which at present he has the most need of. Some honest men of the first trade of St. Matthew, who gather together the Jews and Christians at the gates of your city, have seized something in the breeches pocket of an Israelitish page, belonging to the poor circumcised, who has the honor to tender you this billet, with all proper submission and humility. I beg you leave to join my amen to his at a venture. I but just saw you at Paris as Moses saw the Deity, and should be very happy in seeing you face to face. If the word face can any ways be applied to me, preserve some remembrance of your old eternal humble servant, who loves you with that chaste and tender affection which the religious Solomon had for his 300 Shuhamites. Voltaire's prodigious wit and sarcasm were so exuberant, that he expended them upon all people and all subjects, even himself, when occasion admitted of it. In one of his letters, addressed to the Elector Palatine, September 9, 1761, he gives this excuse for not attending at the court: "I should really make an excellent figure amidst the rejoicings of your electoral highness. It was only, I think, in the Egypt of antiquity that skeletons were admitted to a place in their festivals. To say the truth, my lord, it is all over with me. I laugh indeed sometimes, but I am forced to acknowledge that pain is an evil. It is a comfort to me that your highness is well, but I am fitter for an extreme unction than a baptism. May the peace serve for an era to mark the prince's birth, and may his august father preserve his regard for, and accept the profound respects of his little Swiss, Voltaire." In politics, Voltaire was not very far advanced. He seems to have had no idea of a nation without a king. A monarch who should not commit any very flagrant acts of tyranny was as much as he appeared to desire. He evidently did not foresee the great revolution that was so soon to burst forth in France, but that he mainly contributed by his writings to bring it about there can be no doubt. His influence upon the men of his time, both in France and Europe, is ably depicted by such writers as Lamartine, Quinet, and Brougham. Voltaire's was the one great mind of his day, whose thoughts engrossed the attention of all men. He was great by his learning, his genius, and his benevolence; and this man was the champion of reason, the enemy of superstition, and an infidel. Quinet, in his lectures on the Romish Church, says, "I watched for 40 years the reign of one man, who is in himself the spiritual director, not of his country, but of his age. From the corner of his chamber he governs the kingdom of spirits. Intellects are every day regulated by his. One word written by his hand traverses Europe. Princes love and kings fear him. They think they are not sure of their kingdom if he be not with them. Whole nations, on their side, adopt without discussion, and emulously repeat every syllable that falls from his pen. Who exercises this incredible power, which had been nowhere seen since the Middle Ages? Is he another Gregory the Second? Is he a pope? No. Voltaire. We conclude our little sketch with the eloquent words of Lamartine, who describes in a few sentences the inestimable services rendered to free thought and intellectual progression by the sage of Ferney. If we judge of men by what they have done, then Voltaire is incontestably the greatest writer of modern Europe. No one has caused, through the powerful influence of his genius alone, and the perseverance of his will, so great a commotion in the minds of men. His pen aroused a world, and has shaken a far mightier empire than that of Charlemagne, the European empire of a theocracy. His genius was not force, but light. Heaven had destined him not to destroy, but to illuminate, and wherever he trod, light followed him, for reason, which is light, had destined him to be first her poet, then her apostle, and lastly her idol. End of chapter 7 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Read for you by Ted DeLorme. Chapter number 8 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh, Chapter 8. John Toland. In the Augustan age of free thought, no British writer achieved more renown or performed greater services to biblical criticism than John Toland. His life would fill a volume, while his works would stock a library. True to his convictions, he spoke like a man and died as a hero. His books are strewn with classical illustrations, and deal so with abstract and to us uninteresting arguments, that we shall simply give a brief sketch of the life of this extraordinary man. He gave his thoughts to the scholars at the same time that Woolston addressed the people. Conjointly they revolutionized opinion in our favor. Toland was born on November 30th, 1670, at Londonderry, in Ireland. It is said his registered name was James Junius. Another account says Julius Caesar, but we have been unable to find any authentic date for either supposition, and whatever his name was registered, we have indisputable evidence that he was always called John Toland. We have less proof as to his parentage. Some writers allege that he was the natural son of a Catholic priest, while others contend that he was born of a family once affluent, but at the time of his birth in very reduced circumstances. Whether this was the case or the reverse, young Toland received a liberal education. He was early taught the classics, studied in the Glasgow College, and on leaving Glasgow he was presented with letters of credit from the city magistrates, highly flattering to him as a man and a scholar. He received the diploma of A.M. at Edinburgh the day previous to the Battle of the Boyne. He finished his studies at the University of Leyden. The first work of importance which Toland published was A Life of John Milton, containing, besides the history of his works, several extraordinary characters of men and books, sects, parties, and opinions. This work being violently opposed, was speedily followed by A Mentor, or a defense of Milton's life, containing 1. A general apology for all writings of that kind; 2. A catalogue of books attributed in the primitive times to Jesus Christ, his apostles, and other eminent persons, with several important remarks relating to the canon of Scripture; 3. A complete history of the book, entitled Icon Basilica, proving Dr. Gaudin, and not King Charles I, to be the author of it, etc. Those works established the fame of Toland, as well as formed the groundwork for persecution, which hunted him even on his death bed. In the year 1699, Toland collected, edited, and published from the original manuscripts the whole of the works of James Harrington, prefixed by a memoir of this extraordinary theorist. In his preface, he says that he composed this work in his beloved retirement at Cannon, near Banstead, in Surrey. From this, along with other excerpts scattered throughout his works, we cannot but infer that at the outset of his career he possessed a moderate competence of worldly wealth and social position. He says his idea was to transmit to posterity the worthy memory of James Harrington, a bright ornament to useful learning, a hearty lover of his native country, and a generous benefactor to the whole world; a person who obscured the false lustre of our modern politicians, and equaled, if not exceeded, all the ancient legislators. This to us is an interesting fact, for it shows the early unanimity which existed between the earlier reformers in politics and those of theology. The supervision of the Oceana by Toland bears the same inferential analogy, as if Mr. Holyoake were the biographer and publisher of the New Moral World, and its author. In 1700 he published Anglia Libera, or the Limitation and Succession of the Crown of England, explained and asserted, etc. This book is concluded by the following apothegm, assuring the people that no king can ever be so good as one of their own making, as there is no title equal to their approbation, which is the only divine right of all magistracy, for the voice of the people is the voice of God. In 1702, Toland spent some time in Germany, publishing a series of letters to a friend in Holland, entitled "Some Remarks on the King of Prussia's Country, on his Government, his Court, and his numerous Palaces." About this time appeared "The Art of Governing by Parties." This was always a favorite subject of the old Freethinkers, and is still further elucidated by Bolingbroke. In 1707 he published a large treatise in English and Latin, as "A Philippic Oration to incite the English against the French," a work I have never seen. We now return to an earlier date, and shall trace the use of his theological works. The first of note, 1696, was "Christianity Not Mysterious," showing that there is nothing in the gospel contrary to reason, nor above it, and that no Christian doctrine can be properly called a mystery. As soon as this book was issued from the press, it was attacked with unmanly virulence. One man, Peter Brown, who was more disgustingly opposed to Toland than the rest, was made a bishop, and by far the greatest majority amongst the Anglican clergy who attacked him were all rewarded by honors and preferment. The author was accused of making himself a new heresiarch; that there was a tradition amongst the Irish that he was to be a second Cromwell, and that Toland himself boasted that before he was 40 years old he would be governor over a greater country than Cromwell, and that he would be the head over a new religion before he was 30. One of his opponents publicly stigmatizes him as saying that he, Toland, himself designed to be as great an impostor as Mahomet, and more powerful than the Pope, while the Puritans denounced him as a disguised Jesuit, and the Papists as a rancorous nonconformist. To complete the comedy, the Irish Parliament condemned his book to be publicly burnt, some ecclesiastics loudly murmuring that the author should be burned with it. Others, more moderate, were anxious that Toland should burn it himself, while at last they came to a unanimous resolution to burn it in front of the threshold of his door, so that when the author appeared, he would be obliged to step over the ashes of his own book, which was accordingly done amid the brutal cheers of an ignorant and infuriated populace. As a proof of the high esteem in which Toland was held by the few able and liberal men of the day, we extract the following account from the correspondence of John Locke and Mr. Molyneux. The latter gentleman, writing to the former, says: "I am told the author of Christianity Not Mysterious is of this country, and that his name is Toland; but he is a stranger in these parts, I believe. If he belongs to this kingdom, he has been a good while out of it, or I have not heard of any such remarkable man among us. In another letter, the same writer says, "In my last letter to you there was a passage relating to the author of Christianity Not Mysterious. I did not then think he was so near me as within the bounds of this city, but I find since that he has come over hither, and have had the favor of a visit from him. I now understand that he was born in this country, but that he has been a great while abroad, and his education was for some time under the great Leclerc. But that for which I can never honor him too much is his acquaintance and friendship to you, and the respect which, upon all occasions, he expresses for you. I propose a great deal of satisfaction in his conversation. I take him to be a candid freethinker, and a good scholar. But there is a violent sort of spirit which reigns here, which begins already to show itself against him, and I believe will increase daily, for I find the clergy alarmed to a mighty degree against him. And last Sunday he had his welcome to this city by hearing himself harangued against out of the pulpit by a prelate of this country." Locke's posthumous works, edited by de Mazieux. Mr. Locke in return says, "For the man I wish very well, and could give you, if it needed, proofs that I do so, and therefore I desire you to be kind to him. But I must leave it to your prudence in what way and how far, for it will be his fault alone if he proves not a very valuable man, and have not you for his friend." To this Mr. Molyneux writes to Mr. Locke, "I look upon Mr. Toland as a very ingenious man, and I should be very glad of any opportunity of doing him service, to which I think myself indispensably bound by your recommendation." Soon after this, Mr. Molyneux describes the treatment Toland underwent in Ireland. In another letter to Locke, "He has had his opposers here, as you will find by a book which I have sent to you. The author, Peter Brown, is my acquaintance, but two things I shall never forgive in his book. The one is the foul language and opprobrious names he gives Mr. Toland. The other is, upon several occasions, calling in the aid of the civil magistrate, and delivering up Mr. Toland to secular punishment. This indeed is a killing argument, but some will be apt to say, that where the strength of his reason failed him, then he flies to the strength of his sword. And this reminds me of a business that was very surprising to many, the presentment of some pernicious books and their authors by the grand jury of Middlesex. This is looked upon as a matter of dangerous consequence, to make our civil courts judges of religious doctrines, and no one knows upon a change of affairs whose turn it may be next to be condemned. But the example has been followed in this country, and Mr. Toland and his book have been presented here by a grand jury, not one of whom I am persuaded ever read one leaf in Christianity Not Mysterious. Let the Sorbonne forever now be silent. A learned grand jury, directed by as learned a judge, does the business much better. The dissenters here were the chief promoters of this matter, but when I asked one of them, what if a violent Church of England jury should present Mr. Baxter's books as pernicious, and condemn them to the flames by the common executioner, he was sensible of the error, and said he wished it had never been done. Mr. Locke, in his reply, coincides with his friend, and says, "The dissenters at best consider, but they are a sort of men which will always be the same." A remark which 150 years has not failed in its truthfulness. Mr. Molyneux concludes his remarks in reference to Toland as follows: "Mr. Toland is at length driven out of our kingdom. The poor gentleman at last wanted a meal's meat, and the universal outcry of the clergy ran so strong against him, that none durst admit him to their tables. The little stock of money which he had was soon exhausted. He fell to borrowing, and to complete his hardships, the Parliament fell on his book, voted it to be burnt by the common hangman, and ordered the author to be taken into custody by the sergeant at arms, and to be prosecuted by the attorney general. Hereupon he is fled out of this kingdom, and none here knows where he has directed his course." From this correspondence we glean the following facts: that John Locke and Mr. Molyneux were favorable to free thought; that, on Locke's authority, Toland possessed abilities of no common order; that Toland was unjustly persecuted, and he met with the sympathy of the liberals. Toland, having received a foretaste of his country's vengeance, retired for 2 years to Germany, where he was welcomed by the first scholars of the age. Hearing that the House of Convocation in London was about to denounce 2 of his works as heretical, Christianity Not Mysterious and Amintor, he hastened to England, and published 2 letters to the Prolocutor, which were never laid before Convocation. He insisted that he should be heard in his own defense before sentence was passed on his works, but as usual this wish was denied him. A legal difficulty prevented the bishops from prosecuting the works, and Toland gave the world a full account in his Vindicius Liberius. The letters to Serena, written in a bold, honest, unflinching manner, were the next performances of Toland. The first letter is on the origin and force of prejudices. It is founded on a reflection of Cicero that all prejudices spring from moral and not physical sources, and while all admit the power of the senses to be infallible, all strive to corrupt the judgment by false metaphor and unjust premises. Toland traces the progress of superstition from the hands of a midwife to those of a priest, and shows how the nurse, parent, schoolmaster, professor, philosopher, and politician all combine to warp the mind of man by fallacies from his progress in childhood, at school, at college, and in the world. How the child is blinded with an idea, and the man with a word. The second letter is a history of the soul's immortality among the heathens. A lady had been reading Plater's Phaedo, and remarked as to how Cato could derive any consolation from the slippery and vague suppositions of that verbiant dialogue. Toland, therefore, for her edification, drew up a list of the specifications of the ancients on the subject, analyzing in its progress the varying phases of the fables of the Elysian fields, the Charons, the Styx, etc., deriving them all from the ancient Egyptians. Toland thought the idea had arisen among the people, like our witches, ghosts, and fairy stories, and subsequently defended by the philosophers, who sought to rule their passions by finding arguments for their superstitions, and thus the rise of their exoteric and esoteric doctrines were the first foundations of the belief in the immortality of the soul. The third letter is on the origin of idolatry, or, as it might rather be called, a history of the follies of mankind. He traces the causes, the origin, and the science of superstition, its phenomena and its devotees, proving that all the sacrifices, prayers, and customs of idolatry are the same in all ages. They only differ in language and adaptability of climate, and that with the fall of judicial astrology, idolatry received its greatest blow, for while men thought that priests could control destiny, they feared them. But this idea destroyed, it removed the terror which so long had existed as an immediate object betwixt the man and this sacerdotal tyrant. In letter fourth, addressed to a gentleman in Holland, showing Spinoza's system of philosophy to be without any principle or foundation, and in the concluding article, Toland argues that motion is essential to matter, in answer to some remarks by a noble friend on the above. In the 15th section of this argument, Toland thus rebuts the allegation, that were motion indissolubly connected with matter, there must be extension without surface for motion or matter to exert their respective powers upon. It is often used as an argument, that if a vase was filled with any commodity to the utmost extent, where would be the space for motion? We know that in a kettle of water, if there is no outlet for the steam, which is the motion of the water, the kettle will burst. Toland says, "You own most bodies are in actual motion, which can be no argument that they have been always so, or that there are not others in actual repose. I grant that such a consequence does not necessarily follow, though the thing may itself be true. But, however, it may not be amiss to consider how far this actual motion reaches, and is allowed, before we come to treat of rest. Though the matter of the universe be everywhere the same, yet, according to its various modifications, it is conceived to be divided into numberless particular systems, vortices, or whirlpools of matter; and these again are subdivided into other systems, greater or less, which depend on one another, as every one on the whole, in their centres, textures, frame, and coherence. Our sun is the centre of one of the larger systems, which contains a great many small ones within the sphere of its activity, as all the planets which move about it; and these are subdivided into lesser systems that depend on them, as his satellites wait upon Jupiter, and the moon on the earth. The earth again is divided into the atmosphere, ground, water, and other principal parts; these again into the vegetable, animal, and mineral kingdoms. Now, as all these depend in a link on one another, so their matter is mutually resolved into each other; for earth, air, fire, and water are not only closely blended and united, but likewise interchangeable, transformed in a perpetual revolution; earth becoming water, water air, air ether, and so back again in mixtures without end or number. The animals we destroy contribute to preserve us, till we are destroyed to preserve other things, and become parts of grass, or plants, or water, or air, or something else that helps to make other animals, and they one another, or other men, and these again into stone, or wood, or metals, or minerals, or animals again, or become parts of all these, and of a great many other things, animals or vegetables, daily consuming and devouring each other. So true it is that everything lives by the destruction of another. All the parts of the universe are in this constant motion of destroying and begetting, of begetting and destroying, and the greater systems are acknowledged to have their ceaseless movements, as well as the smallest particles, the very central globes of the vortices revolving on their own axis, and every particle in the vortex gravitating towards the centre. Our bodies, however we may flatter ourselves, do not differ from those of other creatures, but, like them, receive increase or diminution by nutrition or evacuation, by accretion, transpiration, and other ways, giving some parts of ours to other bodies, and receiving again of theirs, not altogether the same yesterday as today, nor to continue the same tomorrow, being alive in a perpetual flux, like a river, and in the total dissolution of our system at death, to become parts of 1,000 other things at once, our bodies partly mixing with the dust and the water of the earth, partly exhaled and evaporated into the air, flying to so many different places, mixing and incorporating with numerous things. No parts of matter are bounded to any one figure or form, losing and changing their figures and forms continually; that is, being in perpetual motion, dipped or worn, or ground to pieces, or dissolved by other parts, acquiring their figures, and these theirs, and so on incessantly. Earth, air, fire, and water, iron, wood, and marble, plants and animals, being rarefied, condensed, liquefied, congealed, dissolved, coagulated, or any other way, resolved into one another. The whole face of the earth exhibits those mutations every moment to our eyes, nothing continuing 1 hour numerically the same; and these changes being but several kinds of motion, are therefore the incontestable effects of universal action. But the changes in the parts make no change in the universe, for it is manifest that the continual alterations, successions, revolutions, and transmutations of matter cause no accession or diminution therein, no more than any letter is added or lost in the alphabet by the endless combinations and transpositions thereof into so many different words and languages. for a thing no sooner quits one form than it puts on another, leaving as it were the theatre in a certain dress, and appearing again in a new one, which produces a perpetual youthfulness and vigor, without any decay or decrepitness of the world, as some have falsely imagined, contrary to reason and experience; the world, with all the parts and kinds thereof, continuing at all times in the same condition. But the species still continue by propagation, notwithstanding the decay of the individuals, and the death of our bodies is but matter going to be dressed in some new form. The impressions may vary, but the wax continues still the same, and indeed death is in effect the very same thing with our birth. For as to die is only to cease to be what we formerly were, so to be born is to begin to be something which we were not before. Considering the numberless successive generations that have inhabited this globe, returning at death into the common mass of the same, mixing with all the other parts thereof, and to this the incessant river like flowing and transpiration of matter every moment from the bodies of men while they live, as well as their daily nourishment, inspiration of air, and other additions of matter to their bulk, it seems probable that there is no particle of matter on the whole earth which has not been a part of man. Nor is this reasoning confined to our own species, but remains as true of every order of animals or plants, or any other beings, since they have been all resolved into one another by ceaseless revolutions; so that nothing is more certain than that every material thing is all things, and that all things are but manifestations of one. In his reply to Wotton, who attacks those letters to Serena, Toland says they were addressed to a lady, the most accomplished then in the world. The name of the lady will probably remain forever a mystery. In 1718 he published the celebrated work Nazarenus, or Jewish Gentile and Mahometan Christianity, which caused an immense sensation at the time it appeared, and led to his Manganentes, 1720, a work singularly profound and effective. In the same year he gave the world Tetradimus, containing Hodigus, or the pillar of cloud and fire, that guided the Israelites in the wilderness, not miraculous, but a thing equally practiced by other nations, and Clidophorus, or of the exoteric and esoteric philosophy, and Hypatia. There is a long preface to those books, from under an elm in Binsbury, or Chabham's camp, on the warren at the south end of Wimbledon Common, 1720. About this time Pantheisticon appeared, written as a caricature on church liturgies, which Archdeacon Hare denounced as downright atheism. Along with the above, Toland wrote a multitude of small pamphlets. He translated the fables of Aesop, and published a poem entitled Clito, which caused much excitement at the time, and as it represented Toland's ideal character, we reprinted it in the London Investigator. His earlier political works were esteemed so valuable in the defense of the Protestant succession, and advancing the interests of the Elector, subsequently King of England, that in one of his visits paid to that court, he was presented by the Electress with miniature portraits of herself and family. The following is a catalogue of the works of Toland which have never yet been published, and the works in which they are mentioned: The History of Socrates, in the Life of Harrington; Systems of Divinity Exploded, an epistolary dissertation, in Christianity Not Mysterious; The History of the Canon of the New Testament, in Nazarenus; Republica Mosaica, in Nazarenus; A Treatise Concerning Tradition, in Tetradimus. There were several other works, part of them written, which passed into the hands of Lord Molesworth, we believe, part of which were published, and the History of the Druid, and also Giordano Bruno, but whether they exist at the present time or not, we are unable to say. There is also great difficulty in deciding as to the manner of Toland's life. Of this, however, we are certain, that he caused great opposition in his own day, and he was patronized by able men. He edited an edition of Lord Shaftesbury's letters, and published a work of that noble lord's surreptitiously. He mingled amongst the German courts, and appeared on terms of equality with the elite of the philosophers and the aristocracy. The brief memoir prefaced to one of his works is an epistolary document addressed to a noble lord. His acquaintance with Locke, Shaftesbury, Collins, Molesworth, and Molyneux must have proceeded from other causes than his genius, or why was Toland exalted when Mandeville, Chubb, and the brave Woolston are never so much as alluded to? We consider that there is a strong probability that he was wealthy, or at least possessed of a moderate competence. His abilities were of a curious order. He seemed to be one of a school which rose about this time to advocate free thought, but shackled by a dogma. His collegiate education gave him an early liking for the dead languages, and he carried out the notion of the ancients, that the exoteric or esoteric methods were still in force. From a careful perusal of the works of the fathers, and the contemporary books of the heathens, he fancied that all the superstitions in the world differed but in degree; that religion was but the organic cause of superstition, the arguments made for it by the philosophers to propitiate the vulgar. This idea, in the main, was agreed to by Woolston, although his violent discourses, which were addressed to the unlearned, contain within them the germ of their intrinsic popularity. Yet even Woolston's works, notwithstanding their bluff exterior, had something more within them than what the people could appreciate, or even the present race of Freethinkers can always understand; for underneath that unrivalled vein of sarcasm, there was in every instance an esoteric view, which comprehended the meaning by which the earlier Christians understood the Gospels, and rendered them on the same scale as the works of the ancients. The renowned William Whiston was another who interpreted Scripture in a similar manner. All those writers would have been Swedenborgians if there had been no free thought, while Whiston would have been an atheist had there been no representative of that school. We do not consider Toland, then, as an absolute deist. At that time the age was not so far progressed as to admit a biblical scholar into the extreme advanced list. And when a man has spent the whole of his childhood in a sectarian family, and his youth and early manhood in a university, it is an impossibility to throw off at one struggle the whole of his past ideas. He may be unfettered in thought, and valiant in speech, still there is the encyclopedia of years hanging upon him as a drag to that extreme development which he wishes, but cannot bring his passions to follow. Not that we would by any means observe that Toland was comparatively behind his age, but that even in his more daring works he still had a vague idea of Scripture being partly inspired, although overlaid with a mass of ecclesiastical verbiage. It also seems a mystery how the works of Woolston could be condemned, his person seized, while in the case of Toland we hear of nothing but his works being burnt. Why was Convocation so idle? Why make idle threats, and let their victim ramble at large? Was it because the one had powerful friends and the other had none? Or was it that in the earlier portion of the career of Toland the invisible hand of Bolingbroke stayed the grasp of persecution? Or was Shaftesbury's memory so esteemed that his friend was untouched? Those particulars we cannot learn, but they will take rank with other parallel cases, as when the same government prosecuted Paine and gave Gibbon a sinecure, or, nearer our own times, when a series of men were imprisoned for atheism, and Sir William Molesworth published similar sentiments without hindrance. In the History of the Soul's Immortality, Toland thus gives the explanation respecting the exoteric and esoteric doctrines of Pythagoras. Pythagoras himself did not believe the transmigration which has made his name so famous to posterity, for in the internal or secret doctrine he meant no more than the eternal revolution of forms in matter, those ceaseless vicissitudes and alterations which turn everything into all things, and all things into anything. As vegetables and animals become part of us, we become part of them, and both become parts of 1,000 other things in the universe, each turning into water, water into air, etc., and so back again in mixtures without end or number. But in the external or popular doctrine he imposed on the mob, by an equivocal expression, that they should become various kinds of beasts after death, thereby to deter them the more effectually from wickedness. Though the poets embellished their pieces with the opinion of the soul's immortality, yet a great number of them utterly rejected it, for Seneca was not single in saying, "Naught after death, and death itself is naught; of a quick race only the utmost goal. Then may the saints lose all their hope of heaven, and sinners quit their racky fears of hell." We now dismiss John Toland from our view. He was one of the most honest, brave, truthful, and scholastic of the old Deists. His memory will be borne on the wings of centuries, and if ever a true millennium does arise, the name of this sterling Freethinker will occupy one of the brightest niches in its pantheon of worthies. End of Chapter 8 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Read for you by Ted DeLorme.